Good morning, everyone. It is time for us to begin our next session, Strategy Session 3, Barriers No More, Facility Access to Charter Schools. So, if you want to learn about charter schools and facilities, you are in the right room. If you're not, that's okay. You can still stay. You'll learn a lot of great things. So, my name is Gerard Robinson. I am the Executive Director of the Center for Advancing Opportunity, located here in Washington, D.C. I am a charter school founder, former authorizer, and grant provider, so I am glad to be with this group. By a show of hands, how many people in here are either charter school founders, educators, board members? Just by a show of hands. All right. So for those who've raised your hand, how many do you believe that facilities is one of your top 3 challenges? And I see a couple of legs in the air as well. So we know it's a big area. So you're at the right place. So we know that throughout the United States, one of the biggest areas expanding charter schools is access to quality facilities. And states have done a number of innovative things to try to encourage it, but we also know there have been some regulations and other things to stop the advancement of charter schools. Without the access to facilities, it's going to be tough to educate people, and so what we've decided to do was to bring people together to talk about the challenges with direct funding, access to free facilities, and also affordable financing. The takeaway for all of you is that policymakers should think about solutions ranging from bond financing to state grants to make it happen. We know that in Colorado, they adopted the Moral Obligation Program. In Texas, the Permanent School Fund, and we'll soon hear about the School Facility Center at the National Alliance. And so we have 3 people today who are going to talk to us about what they do and why facilities matter. So I'm going to go in a certain order. First, we've got Christy Wolf, who is the Senior Policy Advisor for the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools. For over 20 years, she has been involved in working in federal education policy. She spent 8 years at the U.S. Department of Education, having worked in a number of roles, particularly as related to the Associate Deputy Secretary for Policy. And she also worked from a staff member for the U.S. House of Representatives, the Committee for Education and the Workforce. She's got a lot of experience, and she's going to talk to us about her work currently at the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools. We've got Dan Schaller, who's with the Colorado League of Charter Schools. He directs their government affairs work, and anyone who's ever had to involve themselves with government affairs works know it's a very interesting job and a lot of fun. And so in that role, he's working to support legislation and particularly to advance how they can work with charter schools and districts to advance high-quality schools. He came to Colorado in 2003 after having spent some time as an educator at a Denver high school and then moved over to policy. Last, we've got Joe Sidleski. We were talking earlier about his name. He's at the Texas Education Agency. He is Associate Commissioner for School Improvement, Innovation, and Charter Schools at the Texas Education Agency. Before joining, he spent a number of years at the Dell Foundation, where he led the Quality School Options Innovation to Access portfolio. And now he's working in Texas and will give us a good state level perspective on what we're going to do. So I'm going to kick it off with the first question going to Christy. So you've been advocating for charters at the national level. We know the role the Department of Education plays in this area. You know, can you give us a broad overview of why it's so hard for charter schools to obtain funds and to also find money to support them?
Sure. Good morning. So my role here is to provide the big picture, what the problem is. And we were chatting before the panel about the name of the panel, Barriers No More. So are we supposed to be up here saying problem solved? Those walls have been built, charter school facilities are in place. Well, not exactly, but we have some positive things that we can talk about today, but we're also talking about a real issue, one of the fundamental issues that could be getting in the way of charter school expansion around the country. So just by way of starting sort of back at the beginning, when charters were conceived of more than 25 years ago, the charter bargain of autonomy in exchange for increased accountability. Well, what didn't come as part of that bargain was a building. And I think ever since then, folks in the charter community have been trying to figure out how to work that out. I think at the beginning, folks didn't conceive of an environment where school districts would prefer to see empty buildings rot on their lots than hand them over to a charter school or outright prohibit handing them over. Ideally, what you would like to see is a charter school get a building when they open, when they get their charter, but that is not what happens. And so that's what I'm going to talk about, is all the challenges that come about as a result of that, and why charter schools as public schools don't have the same access to buildings as traditional public schools and traditional school districts. So the reason really comes down to two primary reasons. There's the governance structure of charter schools being outside of the traditional funding system of, in most cases, where there are facilities challenges, and then the outright opposition of school districts to charters having buildings or seeing that as a way of impeding their growth. So as I mentioned, when charters are first authorized by the entity that approves their existence, they don't get a building. They submit an application, they have to show funding. In some states, they actually do have to show that they have a building, but just because they have a charter does not mean that they're going to open. And this is particularly more challenging if the charter school authorizer is not a school district and they're on their own in terms of their funding sources or access to buildings. So charter schools, as being outside of traditional school districts, a lot of times their funding is not coming from a district at all, it's coming from the state. There are a lot of advantages and funding sources that school districts have that charters don't have. So these are the key things. There's 4 key things that school districts have that charter schools do not have. First of all, school districts have access to state funds to cover the cost of school construction, and charter schools don't. Districts, number 2, can also sell bonds for construction projects, and they don't have to cover the cost of that debt out of their own operating costs. The taxpayers can cover that. Thirdly, school districts can raise property taxes. We don't have enough money for school buildings. Our buildings are crumbling, so let's just raise taxes. Well, charter schools don't typically have that authority, and they actually don't necessarily benefit, except for in some states, which we'll hear about later, from those property taxes being raised. Lastly, school districts have assets. They have buildings. They sit on top of land. Charter schools don't come with that in their portfolio, even charter schools that have been in existence for a long period of time. So these are 4 key things that districts have that charter schools don't have, and so they don't get a building up front, they don't get a free building up front. And anything else that you're trying to do to help them is to make up for the fact that they're starting, miles behind where traditional public schools are when it comes to getting a building. So where the way we see this play out in the charter school community is in the following ways. First of all, a lack of a permanent home. A lot of charter schools don't own their building, they have to lease. We were part of some survey work that was done of charter schools, and we found that of the majority of charter schools, about 53% were renting or leasing space. And only about a quarter of them had constructed their own building. And so that leads to what charters are great at, which is creativity, creative use of space. But I think some charter schools would prefer to not have to be so creative on this front. Charter school leaders are not real estate experts, finance experts. They want to be creative with their curriculum and their mission, not necessarily trying to figure out how to convert a label factory into a school that meets all the environmental standards that they need to meet. So this also impacts growth. Charter school may find a place to have their school to start with, maybe leasing it, but then the prospect of adding grades or growing is further stymied by the fact that they would have to move or find a different building or raise significant amount of capital to be able to serve more students. Parents may be banging on the door, they may be able to demonstrate results through the roof, but the building will get in the way of them serving more children. Our survey work also found that nearly 1 in 5 charters has had to delay the opening of their charter school because of facility. And some charter schools never even open. They'll get the charter and there's such opposition or obstacles that they never get to serve the children that they were hoping to serve. And as I mentioned earlier, because charters don't have access to the same funding sources as school districts, whether it's through bonding or other mechanisms, they're generally using their operating costs to cover the cost of their facilities. And what that does is it diverts money from the classroom. School districts do not have to use their operational costs fund their buildings. Now, again, some states have addressed this. They provide some funding sources. But generally speaking, charter schools are spending about 10% of their per pupil allocation on their buildings. And then also based on our survey work, nearly half, about 40% of charter schools report that they lack some fundamental amenities such as gyms, playground space, athletic science labs, libraries. So there's, in that creativity of actually getting a building, they're not necessarily getting all the components of that building that they would like to have. So what we have to try to address all of these challenges is a patchwork of state and federal policies to try to either provide per pupil facilities aid, reduce the cost of capital, whether it's through more obligation programs at the state level. There's some credit enhancement programs at the federal level. There's states to provide some per pupil costs to cover operating expenses for charter schools. There's some other states that have some loan programs, others that allow charter schools to share in some of the programs that are also targeted at school districts. So some of our work at the Alliance keeps track of all the state policies in place, but no state has everything, and no state's able to actually, even if they have the most ideal laws on the book, they're not actually being enforced in every single situation or even in any situation. You could have a state that says charter schools got a first right of refusal of any vacant building, but at the end of the day, someone's got to declare that building to be surplus and extra and actually tell that charter that they can have it. So there's often a mismatch between the policy and its implementation. And at the federal level, there's some important key programs as well that are in place that we advocate on behalf, but they're not enough. But one I will mention, and we can talk about later in our discussion, are programs that are designed to incentivize state policies. So as part of the charter schools program, there's a state facility incentive grant program, and very few states have actually taken advantage of this program. But if you have per pupil allocations in your state for charter schools, if you've made those legislative changes, then you're eligible to apply for this program. And it actually has moved the needle in certain states. But it hasn't really gained momentum because of funding, and this is a particular program that we're interested in seeing leverage better state policies for charter schools. And given the future interest in an infrastructure bill in Congress and conversations about state policies and opportunities for reducing cost of capital for any kind of infrastructure, we see opportunities there. So I'll stop. That's the national landscape.
Oh, thank you, Christy. You mentioned the importance of real estate, and I spoke to a couple of friends of mine who were charter school founders, and I said, if you knew then what you know now, what course in college would you have taken? And all of them said real estate, at least one course, because facilities have become pretty big. So she provided a really good overview of the federal, national level. So let's turn to you, Joe. You're in Texas. You work for a very large Department of Education or an agency. You have a lot of charters. You've passed legislation, H.R. 21, and that's provided some support to charters. You also have a permanent fund in place. Talk to us about those two items and what impact you see it having on charter school facilities or growth possibly in the state.
Cool. Thanks, Gerard. So just to give a little context, Texas has about 750 charter school campuses serving about 300,000 kids, growing at a significant rate every year. And the way charter schools are currently funded in Texas, they get a average daily attendance allotment, which is a per pupil payment of about $9,600 on average per kid. They do not get facilities funding, or they had not gotten facilities funding in the past until the recent legislative session. I'll talk more about that. There's really four things that the legislators and agency have done over the last 4 to 5 years to create a more conducive environment for operators. The first that I'll talk about is our permanent schools fund. So we've got a permanent schools fund, which is used to guarantee bonds for charter operators who go out to the market. The operators have to have BBB plus ratings. So in some respects, it's very good for large established operators who've got a financial track record. It's not so easy to access if you're brand new as an operator. The second one is House Bill 21, which was passed the last legislative session. For the first time, the House and the Senate kind of appropriated funds to charter schools to use for facilities. and it's $60 million, and given the size of our sector, that's not astronomical. But how that works out is about $200 per kid. So instead of getting $9,600 per pupil in the past, which is what they've done, they get the $9,600 plus $200 that they can spend on facilities. And the way that it's been defined in the bill is pretty broad. It's not just facilities purchase or lease, it could be improvement as well. The third thing that we've is another bill that was passed last legislative session, Senate Bill 1882. And I know Senator Betancourt is here. I saw him out in the hallway. He and his staff were the ones who carried that in the Senate, and Representative Koop carried that in the House. But what Senate Bill 1882 does is provide an incentive for school districts to authorize charter schools. Now in Texas, everyone knows the state agency as the authorizer, and we do have a massive portfolio of schools, 700. But in Texas, all 1,206 of the districts in Texas are also authorizers. Before Senate Bill 1882, only 4 had ever authorized a charter school. Senate Bill 1882 provides 2 incentives. One is districts get additional per pupil funding if they will authorize an in-district charter school. Now, what's implicit, not explicit in the law, is that that partnership will probably result in an operator getting a facility, right, at low or no cost. The accountability accrues to the district, and the district also gets a 2-year accountability pause if they've got a struggling school that they've done this with. So there's some incentives to do that. And in the first year of implementing the law, we had 12 districts take advantage of the law, 19 campuses, and we anticipate in the second round, which we're in the midst of right now, that we'll have upwards of 40 charter schools having been authorized by districts, with almost all of them gaining access to a facility in that process. That's not the sole point of the law, but that's allowable under that law, and that's what we've seen happen in a few places. And then the fourth one is the agency has closed 36 charter school operators over the last 5 years. When we close those operators, if they own their buildings and have used state funding to actually improve those buildings, the state has argued that the buildings then, the assets then would come to us upon closure. That's been in the courts, and recently was decided that they do come to us. And now we're discussing how we dispose of those. We haven't made a final decision, but what I can say is this, is that the going-in assumption is that the agency would just sell those buildings. I think what we're really exploring right now and can't make any commitment on is that we'll make those buildings available to charter school operators first at no cost. Now, many of these buildings are not in great condition. Many of them come with debt, but that's actually a better situation than having to remodel the local car dealership into a school in some instances. So those are 4 things that either the legislature or the agency has tried to put in place in the last couple of years to alleviate some of the facilities problems, and or, as Chrissy said, to make it such that operators don't have to divert their per pupil funding to facilities, or as much to facilities as they've had to in the past.
Thanks, Joe. So Dan, you are an advocate, you're also a bipartisan builder to make sure we have support. So you now have the charter school capital development construction funding place, and it's in place now. What is it going to do for Colorado, and what role did bringing together different partners at the table take to make this happen?
Great. Well, thanks, Gerard, and hello, everyone. Dan Schaller from the Colorado League of Charter Schools. We are the charter support organization for the state of Colorado. Much like Joe, maybe I'll just give a little quick background on Colorado and our charter school sector before I get into the specific facilities policies we've been able to enact. So we currently have 255 charter schools spread all across Colorado, serving about 14% of our K-12 population in the state. Those 255 charter schools are in 70 different towns and communities across the entire state, which is a big part of, to get to your question, Gerard, I think why we've been able to build such bipartisan consensus in the state of Colorado, because virtually every legislator has some constituents in charter schools in their legislative district across the political spectrum. So in part as a result of that, and that has required very active cultivation over the years to maintain that bipartisan support, but in part as a result of that, we've been able to string together a decent number of facilities-related initiatives. I'll be the first to admit that this has not necessarily solved the facilities problem. We still contend with plenty of facilities issues ourselves, even though we are ranked number 2 by the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools in terms of our law's access to facilities. So I say all that as a note of caution in that we are constantly trying to find the next thing to figure out the facility situation. That said, we have been fortunate enough to benefit from several things. Number one is the Charter School Capital Construction Fund. So it sounds fairly similar to what Texas has recently enacted, but back in 2000, the state of Colorado created a specific funding stream just for charter school facilities needs. And so every year there's an allocation into that to help cover facilities costs for charter schools. A few years ago, it was woefully inadequate. It was only at about $90 per student. Thankfully, and I should say we see that the typical charter school is having to spend about $725 per student to pay for their building. Thankfully, we've been able to see that increase over the last few years. We've now got it up close to $300 per student. Some of that is from the general fund. Some of that is a result of the marijuana legalization in Colorado, and we have made sure to take advantage of some of that additional revenue in our state. We continue to push as hard as we can to try to get more into that capital construction fund on an annual basis. That is the thing that benefits the most of our schools and is one of the things that they like having on the books the most. Another specific program I'll mention is our state's moral obligation program. This was also passed in the early 2000s, similar to the permanent school fund that Joe was describing. This is for more mature schools. And it enables them to get the state's backing. If they're able to get their own standalone investment grade rating from an independent ratings agency, they can get that then backed up by the state and get the state's moral obligation behind it so that they can get more favorable financing terms, get a lower interest rate, and be able to save money in that respect. We've seen about 30 of the charter schools in Colorado over the years take advantage of that program. Maybe one last quick thing I'll mention is a little bit less facilities related, but important in the charter school funding conversation overall. A couple years ago, we were able to get a bill passed that requires school districts to share their local mill levy override revenue with their charter schools. That is for operational needs, less so for facilities needs, but it was an important bipartisan effort to get that across the finish line to require school districts to share that revenue. So for now, I'll stop there, but look forward to the conversation about additional things we can be trying to do.
If any of you were given a magic wand based upon what you know now with facilities and charters and looking 10 years into the future, what recommendation would you make, let's say, to either a new incoming governor who's interested in charter schools or to state lawmakers who said, you know what, we've been doing the same thing a long time, I think this will work? What'd you say?
So I would say, so as a state agency employee, we implement the laws, don't recommend them, so this is purely theoretical.
And that is okay.
Yes. What I would recommend is I think like we've got a fair amount of supports in place for established operators is to try to consider solutions for the new operators as well. And what I mean by that is like, you know, the permanent school fund backing. You're not going to have an operator who just launched, who's got one school or several grades and go out to the bond markets, but is there some other way to create some sort of instrument for them to kind of get backing or kind of low-cost loans to help them launch schools? That's one thing. And I would say similarly, too, on our House Bill 21, which is the per-pupil funding, there are requirements of performance as well, which again make it difficult for brand-new operators to access those dollars. And one could argue those are folks who are probably most in need at the point of launch to find a facility or not have to worry about real estate. They have to worry about hiring principals, delivering great instruction, and those types of things. So I would say like seeking those types of solutions, which I think could just be modifying existing laws that exist, or finding ways to kind of like de-risk some of the state's backing on earlier stage operators. That would be what I would see like 10 years down the road, like trying to find a way to support the early entrepreneurs and their facilities acquisition. Yeah.
A couple things. I think it would be great to eliminate the monopoly that school districts typically have over their public buildings and put that into the hands of some kind of independent authority or real estate trust that would be an arbiter of who needs the buildings. So take that issue of trying to get at charters' Achilles' heels and not give them the buildings so they can't grow, and make sure that public taxpayer-funded buildings are being used well. to the benefit of students. So magic wand number one, if I get a second magic wand, it would be touching on some of Joe's points, making sure that there's a range of programs available to all types of charters, and that there isn't just a very narrow subset of charters that are able to attract low-cost financing, that all charters that are able to demonstrate that they have a program worthy of getting a charter, that they have the students, they're getting results, that they can get low-cost capital, they can get a building, that they aren't susceptible to higher interest rates loans that are going to drain basically the lifeblood out of their school.
Can I ask just
Sure.
to make this a little bit more conversation? So I had, so the real estate trust idea, would this be like a housing authority in a city or a building authority? Like what do you envision? And do you know if anybody's explored that in any way, shape, or form today? Like we're taking, building facilities ownership and distribution is taken out from underneath a district or is even being considered?
Yes, my understanding is there's something similar to that, but has not been fully realized in DC. The Center for Reinventing Public Education just got a P2P grant awarded to them to start really building out that idea. And it's also an idea that just been floating around for a while. I think maybe Paul Hill was I don't know who claims the original ownership of the idea, but it has been around for a while.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, absolutely. Dan?
Yeah, I would just build off of some of what's been previously said. I think the pressure point we still see in Colorado, even with a suite of options here, is the entry point. And can we create or set up like a revolving loan program for startup charter schools to have immediate access to very low interest or no interest capital? But that still doesn't solve the access question and finding a suitable facility in the first place. One of the things we're looking at is, can we create a statewide inventory of all publicly owned and buildings and land across the entire state to at least have more transparency around what is even out there in the first place. I don't imagine that will solve all the problems, but that's another bite at the apple that we are trying to push on currently.
In a previous life, when I was working with charter schools and trying to open one, I identified two challenges. One, in some cities, the school board itself owned the facility. In some other places, the city council had to sign on to it, or it was a common council. The first thing I would hear is the reason you guys shouldn't receive a building is because A, it's going to mess up our 10-year strategic plan. And if we give you a building, that means that's a building that's going to take us off course. Or B, we're really concerned that this is only going to just open up more doors to bring in families who aren't from here, da-da-da. How much of that do you still hear today, and how should people at least respond to questions like that?
I mean, I think it's a constant refrain, and I think one of the kind of points of Senate Bill 1882 is to try to kind of limit that conversation, not limit it, but actually like add another layer to it, which is you might want a new option in your community, and one way to do that is to bring in an operator and allow them to use a building, and those kids count for your enrollment, they count for your accountability. So it's not we hear it a lot, and I'd say that communities, like I said, there was 12 districts that took advantage of 1882 this first round, and we think we're going to get kind of significantly more in the second round. Kind of changes that conversation a little bit. It doesn't go away, though, but it's we hear it often, and I've even heard one superintendent say the reason they did the partnership was because they wanted to attract students back, and they knew a way to do that was to bring in a partner operator. So no grand solution there, but it is a constant kind of critique.
Dan?
Agreed.
One powerful interest group in education is the Coaches Association, and they play a big role. Another is also the Real Estate Association, and they often don't fit into our equation when we're thinking about school reform. Did you have to work closely, either federal or at the state level, with the Real Estate Agent Association, either statewide or local, to get support for what you're doing in Colorado and Texas? And at the federal level, how do they fit into this conversation, if at all?
I'll start by speaking to Colorado. I cannot say that we've had to work that closely with the real estate agency group on any of the charter-specific policies we've passed thus far. I imagine if we try to continue to build a coalition around the idea I was just talking about, around the statewide inventory, that is definitely a group we could find ourselves engaging with.
Yeah, I'd say similarly, not at the agency level. I mean, there's a possibility that the Realtors Association has been pretty active, and I assume they have been at the legislature, but it's really not something that at the agency level we've interacted very much at all with the Realtors Association.
We have not. There are some rather significant large coalitions interested in infrastructure and vertical infrastructure buildings. I think they are involved, but we're a very small piece of that. And then there's the very charter-specific pieces that we would not have any interaction with.
Got it. In St. Louis, the school system for a number of years said we can't release school buildings because we own them, and we may one day have a reverse and see thousands of students come back. And so what we decided to do, this is when I was at Bail, is we had our Missouri Bail team create a film. It's about 5 minutes long, where they actually went through the neighborhood, took pictures, or actually filmed abandoned buildings where people were sleeping, doing kind of things that we just wouldn't see people do. And they were able to use that to show the state legislature that you should change the regulation as it relates to school building. And at least in that area some years ago, it worked. Is there a role for bringing in families or community members to be a part of the conversation to say, yes, facilities matter in my community because we have abandoned buildings, things are happening, or is that not a winning strategy at this point? Or maybe it should be both?
Yeah, so I'll say, so in Texas also, and I didn't mention this, there's a fifth thing where, like, similar to what Christy had referenced and what Gerard just said, technically districts are supposed to make their excess buildings available to charter schools first. It's very hard for us to enforce that. In fact, would argue that we very rarely even know when a district is actually making a sale of a facility. So one thing that we could do is actually be much more cognizant of what exists out there and what is being bought and sold. In terms of family engagement, I think my experience from 10 years working across the nation funding efforts to kind of launch charter schools, and then in the last year in the agency, is that it's more difficult to get parents to engage in the theoretical concept of a new school. I think where you can engage them is if there's a specific option with a specific program that they might be interested in. Because I found it very difficult, or just observational, I've seen it to be very difficult to engage families in the, hey, these buildings should be released for a charter school, as opposed to these buildings, I want my kid to access this expeditionary learning program that this charter school program might offer. So I guess my advice would be to become a lot more specific about, if you're going to engage parents, about what is the opportunity that could exist in that building in your neighborhood, as opposed to a charter school writ large.
Sure. Dan?
Yeah, I would just add, I think similar to what Joe said, in our experience in Colorado, it is oftentimes when a school has found a location, but the location is woefully inadequate, because then they have a built-in experience and a built-in constituency to be able to become the most powerful advocates possible for needing to improve that facility. It does become harder when you're talking about trying to locate in a brand new building.
So, Christy, I'll give you the last question before we open it to the audience. So rather than give you a magic wand, I'll give you a bottle of wine. And the question is, 2019, new Congress, what should we be looking for, or what should we be advocating for as it relates to charter schools and facilities? Or maybe it's a bottle of gin, I don't know.
Right. So when we're looking at federal advocacy and charter school facilities, there's several tracks. There's the charter-specific track, and then making sure that charter schools are included in any other legislation initiatives that are going on. So say there is going to be an infrastructure bill. What type of infrastructure bill? Will it be mostly about bonds? Will it be about private activity bonds? We had a little fire drill with this back during the Tax Reform Act when New Markets Tax Credit and private activity bonds were on the table and potentially going away. Speaking about parents, we saw a significant amount of energy from the charter school community when those things were on the table in ways that we haven't necessarily seen with other federal issues. So I think what we would like to see is, say there is direct funding for school construction. Not likely, but say there is. Well, we would want to make sure that charter schools have direct access to that funding and are looking at getting a proportionate share to where they are in the community and not entirely dependent on school districts handing them over whatever they think they need, which probably won't be anything, given that it will be a scarce pot of funds, whatever funds might be allocated. We're also looking at potentially a new charter-type infrastructure credit that could be implemented, thrown into some larger infrastructure package. On the charter-specific side, we would like to see increased funding allocations towards the credit enhancement program and more use of the facilities incentive grant program. We're also, it's not an advocacy mechanism, and we mentioned the Charter School Facilities Center at the National Alliance that we just got a federal grant for. That's going to inform the work that we do with Congress as we identify best practices. What are states doing that's working? What has Colorado done? What do they learn? How can we share that? How can we help you all implement the programs that you want to see help your charters? It's going to be the first center that is really focused on charter school facilities, where we have a new project director, Mark Redima, he's here, who will be have his command focus in really trying to bring the resources together to help charter schools. So that's 2019.
Great. So I'm going to open it up to the audience. What I will ask is that you identify yourself, ask a question either for an individual member or for the entire board. We have two people in the back who have a microphone. And before I go to the first question, since we're talking about charter schools, I want to acknowledge Nina Reese, president of the National Alliance of Public Charter Schools, who's in the room, and for the great work that she's been doing. I want to also say hello to Gary Chartrand in the back on the State Board of Education in Florida. And we've got one of the first charter school founders in Florida, who's here right now, T. Willard from Miami. And so what we're going to do is open it up for a question. And whoever asks the first question gets a prize. Got a question up here in the front.
Sure. Right. I'm State Representative Mark Lowry from Arkansas. We had to deal in Arkansas with, Christy, you mentioned the right of first refusal that sometimes is gamed by school districts. Say, well, we'll just never make the building available. So in the last session, we passed a bill that makes it right of access. Of course, we're a year and a half in of trying to develop the final rules on that. So the school districts are still fighting us on implementation. The question I had for Joe is the funding for that. You were talking about the per student allocation. And I looked up the bill real quick and I saw that the total cost of that bill was $1.8 billion. Is that correct?
For House Bill 21?
Yes.
No, it was 60 million.
Oh, okay. Well, maybe
And in Senate Bill 1882, there's not quite a clear price tag on it. We've been authorized to do it, and it's about $1 million per campus.
Okay, so 60 million, all right. But you did have to throw in some other items that were funded other than charter schools?
Yeah, I mean, so House Bill 21 was done in a special session, so
Right.
like after the last session, maybe one of the last bills actually done. So there are some other things in there for sure. In fact, it was actually tacked into something else. It wasn't like created specifically for that purpose. But I would say this, like they're actually not, that's actually not connected to the district disposition of their buildings and the right of access. There's actually no funding particularly for that in Texas. It's just a statement that districts are supposed to make their buildings, excess buildings, available to charters first.
Right, and that's what we've implemented is that each school district has to identify unused and underutilized school buildings, but unfortunately some of them have gone into such decay. One charter school in eastern Arkansas, once they finally got access to a building, they had to spend something like $5 million just to make the building usable. So that's where that fund actually kicks in, is to be able to do that. Okay. All right, thank you.
Yeah, right, you could use as a charter House Bill 21 funds, but that's still only, it's $200 per kid. I wish we had 735 like Colorado. But, you know, it's better than not having any kind of resources available, though.
Okay, another one in the front. We'll go here, then I'll go to the back. Yes, sir.
Hi, Kevin Teasley, Geo Foundation, Indianapolis, Indiana. Dan, in Colorado, I think you guys passed a law, and maybe you discussed it and I didn't hear it, but you guys passed a law that allows charter schools to participate in bonds that are sold by traditional public school districts. Did you talk about that, or can you share a little bit about that? Because what I'm surprised at is the traditional public school systems are engaging charter schools in the votes to pass the bonds because their parents are engaged and they vote. But I'm not seeing that law talked about and catch wildfire across the country. And is there a reason why that's not happening?
Yeah, great question. Thank you for mentioning that, Kevin. So also amongst the suite of things we've been able to accomplish back in 2008, we did get a procedure put in place that requires districts to include their charter schools, at least in the conversations about the bonds. And this is maybe why I didn't mention it, because it's not a mandate. So if districts have long-term planning commissions talking about potential bond issues, they have to include charter representation on that. They have to solicit proposals from their charter schools for what their facilities needs are. And they have to tell the charter school in writing the reasons why they don't include it if they decide not to include it. But it is still entirely at the district's discretion, which is why I didn't mention it. At the same time, though, I think why it's a good point that you're making is we have seen an uptick in the amount of districts that are including their charter schools in their bonds. So back in 2008, I think it was about 19% of districts had given some of their charter schools some bond dollars. We're now up to 46% of districts are doing that. So whether there's a direct correlation to that bill, or if it's more of a function of the fact that charter school parent populations represent a sizable percentage of a lot of districts and represent a voting bloc that those districts need and want, we have seen an encouraging trend in that direction. Yep.
Here's a mic's coming for you.
In Gary, Indiana, they tried to pass a bond for the traditional public schools. They missed by 2 points. Well, 60% of the kids in Gary, Indiana go to charter schools, and the bond issue excluded charter schools. I'm willing to bet if they included charter schools in that vote, it would have passed overwhelmingly. So, anyway.
I'm curious if, and sorry to ask.
Oh, no,
you a
go ahead,
question,
then we'll go to the
but
gentleman in the back.
On the, on this kind of like, including charter operators in the bonds, is this specific to in Colorado where the districts are the authorizers, or does it apply across the board for where there's, they're not authorized by the local district?
Yeah, it is specific to the charters that are authorized by the local district. And incidentally, about 85% of charter schools in Colorado are authorized. Yeah.
Hey guys, Brian Jodas, Parents for Educational Freedom in North Carolina. This is a bit of a broad question since every state is different and I don't know how it works in every state, but I just wonder your thoughts, broad thoughts on as it relates to transportation. So you talk about accessibility here from a brick and mortar sort of standpoint, but what about the accessibility or even from an equity standpoint as it relates to transportation? So for example, in North Carolina, we've got some incentives for charters to where they can basically get a grant, $100,000 towards transportation, basically towards a bus. That's about enough for one bus. Bus about $8,000. So just wonder broad thoughts as it relates to accessibility to transportation or equity as it relates to transportation for charters.
I'll jump in first. Yeah, I think that's sort of the next frontier, or the thing we're not even talking about right here. It's one thing to talk about buildings and equitable access to funding there, but equally as important, it seems to me, is equitable access to funding for transportation. And the places, I mean, at least in Colorado, where we've seen the most positive involvement of charter schools in transportation is places that have embraced charter schools. The districts that see them as an opportunity, not as an impediment. So Denver Public Schools historically has, at least over the last decade, embraced charter schools. They have a number of their charter schools in district facilities because they see them as part of their family of public school options. And in places where they have, one part of the city, they have what's called the Success Express, which is a bus route that is inclusive of all of the schools, charter or otherwise, in that quadrant of the city. So there's a ton to be said for trying to change that mindset for people to see charter schools as an opportunity and not an impediment.
Yeah, and I'll say in Texas, it's definitely something that we've talked about, although we don't have any grand solutions for either at this point. But I'll say this: we do have two federal charter school program grants, one for startup, one for replication, and in both of those, the winners of those, which are not all of our charters for sure, can use those resources to purchase a bus, in fact. And what we've also seen too is with Senate Bill 1882, and again, it's very early days, right? This was passed about 2 years ago. Very early days, what we're seeing here is that then districts are starting to view charters as a possible part of the set of options that they provide to families. And in every one of those instances, the district is providing transportation, and it's been part of the negotiation, right? So whereas the operator is focused on delivering a great culture, great instruction, and great opportunity, the district in many of these 1882 partnerships to date actually handles transportation and in some instances food service. So that's another way that it was a bill that's just begun and starting to spread, but it's a way to start to try to address that. But it gets to Dan's point, it's also about changing perspectives at the district level to view charters as a possible partner to deliver an educational experience to families and have the districts be the authorizers as opposed to the state. I mean, there's kind of points plus and minus on both sides of the ledger to that. But the idea here is that, folks are gaining access to buildings and transportation. And I'd say the last thing we're seeing in some of the bigger cities is more the operators collaborating themselves to actually use their purchasing power to actually create a charter bus system. It's happening in Austin, Texas, where operators like IDEA, Wayside, KIP, Montessori for All are all trying to collaborate to kind of get one bus schedule and one bus kind of contract, which again is operators taking it in their own hands, but it's something interesting for legislators to consider an incentive or a pilot program to do such a thing, or the federal government.
And there has been an increased emphasis on access and meeting the transportation needs of students in the federal charter schools program, and it was a significant clarification addition to the federal startup grant program to allow for those upfront costs to cover the cost of a bus. So there's more limited at the federal level what you can do, but there's certainly an emphasis on ensuring that transportation isn't an impediment. And it does become more of a live issue in rural areas of North Carolina. It would make sense that you all are wrestling with that more than, say, in Washington, D.C., when no one has access to a bus. So more opportunities for innovation and looking for ideas that work in those situations as opposed to urban environments.
Before I go to the audience, a question just came to my own mind. I know at least 15 years ago, approximately 20% of the charter schools in operation were in churches or privately held schools. One of the schools that helped to support in Richmond opened up initially in a church with capital support from a nonprofit organization, in fact, in North Carolina. In your conversation about facilities, we've primarily focused on public schools naturally. Within your two states or even at the federal level, is there a role for investments into closed private schools or private school churches, for example, that have buildings that could be used?
Yes, all of the above. I'm actually on the board of a charter school that had to start out in renting from a church, and before we were able to locate into a more permanent facility. I don't know how much we explicitly talk about that as part of our advocacy strategy, but it is definitely part of the all hands on deck approach to trying to confront this.
Okay. Yeah, and I appreciate the recommendation. It's actually something I'll take back. It's something earlier Dan said too, which was One thing's creating an inventory of all the facilities that charter operators are actually in today, right? Which is actually something that with 700 plus campuses, we do not have a kind of complete handle on every kind of piece of real estate owned or leased by a charter operator. But the second might be using the power of the authorizer, the agency here, to kind of put out a call to other organizations to say who has space that they're interested in leasing to educators, so that it's not kind of, entrepreneurial operator, founder, and their board trying to kind of beat the bushes, but the state's done a little bit of advanced work to just try to identify where there may be churches or universities that have unused space that might be willing to kind of share. It's a good idea.
Let me see if there's anyone on this side. Okay. Let's go to the gentleman here, and then we'll go to the lady to my left.
Hi, Sion Britton with the Diverse Charter Schools Coalition. I want to thank you all for being here. You all spoke a lot about charter schools trying to find their own facilities, but thinking about more of our urban districts, New York comes to mind. What stories have you all come to contact with, benefits and challenges of charter schools that have to cohabitate with district schools in the same building?
Yeah. I mean, I'll say, so Senate Bill 1882, which I keep going back to here, the impetus for that was a couple of districts that had already done co-locations, right? So one is Spring Branch ISD, just outside of Houston, and that, they have YES operating a wing of a campus, and KIP operating a wing of a campus, and then the district operates a wing of the campus. We've seen a similar thing in Grand Prairie ISD with Uplift, and that's just outside of Dallas. And what's interesting about these 1882s that we've seen in this first round is those are in there, but we haven't seen other co-locations. Part of it's because the way that the rule is written is that the operator must, in order to gain access to the benefit, in order for the district to get the incentive payment, the operator has to be in direct control of instruction at least 51% of the students, right? So the operator has to have a majority of the kids. So in some respects, it may disincentivize co-location, and it's a good point. But we've seen some of it, and what we're seeing now in the early stages, but what we're seeing now in the first round of formal 1882s is less co-location and more just a district saying, I want this partner to manage this campus for me. So it kind of goes against like a possible solution, but what we're seeing and what we've incentivized is more of the partner managing the campus, not managing a part of it.
I'll just say that where we have seen the most co-location happening is in Denver public schools, where, again, because they have embraced charter schools as part of their family of schools, they have placed a number of charter schools in parts of facilities that are vacant but occupied. The other part of it is occupied by another school. That, up to now, has generally been okay and hasn't been problematic. But I do think the headwinds are fierce, and we're going to be facing some difficult situations. Denver has just become a much more volatile environment. The opposition to charter schools has been growing a lot recently there. And I think part of it also is a function of it's one thing when you are an expanding and growing district to be a charter-friendly district. It's another thing when your enrollment is sort of flatlining, which is where what Denver is experiencing right now. For a decade there, it was one of the fastest-growing urban districts in the country, and that made it very easier, I should say, for them to be putting out like call for quality schools, for them to be putting charter schools in some of their vacant facilities. But they've pretty much tapped out all of their vacant facilities at this point. And so we're reaching an interesting point in the history of Denver Public Schools to see how that co-location conversation continues.
And just a brief plug again for our new Charter School Facility Center, we will be looking at that issue, sharing stories, hopefully, and success best practices around co-location and accessing public space in that way. And also, there is a sign-up list. We don't have a website fully up and running, but if you want to be on our mailing list and you want to send us ideas of things like that, like you should look into that. We need information about X, Y, Z. Make sure to get your name on that list. It should be, I think it's in the back and going around.
It's in the back? Okay,
Yeah.
great. Oh, in fact, you got it right there. You now have to sign. Good to see you. Take the question to my left.
Hi, I'm Libba Lyons from Learning Sciences International in West Palm Beach, Florida. And this question has to do with a phenomenon in the state of Florida called the district-managed charter. And my understanding of that is that in many cases, the district, and Joe, I think you alluded to this in some degree, that the district will provide some level of support in logistics and operations and things like that, whereas the charter operator handles curriculum and instruction in the school. And my question is, what is your experience with this kind of relationship between the charter operator and the district as it pertains to facilities themselves? Do you see that often as part of that kind of relationship between the district and the charter operator?
Yeah, I'll say, so one thing I'll clarify is in Texas, there's what are called subchapter D charter schools. Those are authorized by the state agency. Those are the 750 that I mentioned. And then there's subchapter C, so those are district authorized charters. 1882, under previous construction, you could create a subchapter C charter school in many different ways. The difference between that and 1882 is 1882 is a subchapter C, but it requires an independent governance board. And that actually is what the district is negotiating between, like the district and that board. In terms of like what have we seen play out, like it's super early days. What I have seen is the biggest kind of part of the negotiation has been around what does it cost for the district to deliver transportation? What does it cost for the district to deliver food service? What does it cost for the district to provide maintenance for the facility? I mean, unfortunately, most districts actually can't name that number on a per pupil basis. So oddly enough, like a lot of what we've been trying to help districts do when they're engaging in these partnerships is understand what they're currently spending so that they can fairly charge the operator. Now, in state law, in subchapter C, it says that the district cannot charge a premium on the services delivered to the subchapter C charter school. The reality is that nobody really actually, it's not so easy to know exactly what you're spending on it. But, you know, that's been a big part of these first rounds of negotiations. You know, the operator says, I want to buy transportation, food service from you. What does that cost on a per pupil basis? So we'll see how it plays out over time. But on the early stages, like that is 90% of the negotiation are around those specific services that the district will deliver, what they cost, and what the terms of those services will be.
Well, all good things must come to an end, and we are near the end. And so what I would like to do is to give each person, we'll start with Christy, an opportunity just to leave us with some encouraging parting words. You want to begin?
Well, just hearing from your questions, it's just, there are a lot of you wrestling with us. There are a lot of great ideas, and we just want to be a partner and help states and localities do what they can to provide facilities for charter schools. So we're here to help.
So I'll end with three things. One is, and Dan had talked about this too, like getting districts to view charters as partners or part of the family of their options. The agency's created a whole initiative called the System of Great Schools Initiative that districts can opt into. And the whole idea here is that we want to help districts launch calls for quality schools to find both internal teams of educators that are already in the district to design and lead new schools, as well as external partners. And really, the idea here is to say, we want to help districts provide the high-quality, best-fit options that their families want and need, and to be open to different ways to do that. And if they're open to it, then the agency will provide some level of support to it. And we're aligning our ESSA school improvement grants to it. I'll talk about that in my next session. That's a plug for that. But the two other things I would say is, one, share your ideas. I've actually heard ideas up here today already that like I'm going to bring back. And there are folks in the agencies who are willing and interested to hear novel ideas and have an opportunity to consider how to implement them. So if you come up with an initiative, like a pilot for a transportation collaboration or a pilot for a real estate kind of trust idea, bring those to your legislators and your state agencies, because if you don't bring them up, then we won't know to consider them. And then lastly, I'll say this. I know the man from North Carolina said every state is different. I think Texas is the greatest state. If you're an operator and you're looking to run schools, I think we've created a good environment for you all. So please consider Texas as the spot for your next school.
Well,
I have to object there. No, but Colorado is hands down the best state to come operate. But maybe I'll just end by saying, like, while this work is incredibly frustrating and hard, and it can be hard to come up with the innovative solutions or the silver bullet solutions that will solve it, I do still remain optimistic that the environment is on our side. As we continue to move into more non-traditional, hopefully more non-traditional environments, and needing to figure out how to meet the non-traditional needs of an ever-diversifying population of students, I don't think that the unique challenges related to facilities that charters are facing are going to always remain a uniquely charter issue. And so maybe that's a positive note to end on.
So let's give them a round of applause for their work.